So I know this because I've had this experience, and I know a lot of authors have had this experience that when you go, you hear the advice you just gave, and you're like, "Wow, that's what I want to do," and then you go and you see what good editors cost. Can you talk through for the people like why that is a reasonable investment, like the payoffs that come from hiring a good editor, um, short term and long term?
Yeah, no, it's definitely a sizable investment. I think you gotta understand what each step of the process brings you. A lot of authors kind of bulk at the prices for developmental editing, and that makes sense because it's the most expensive type of editing for sure. Um, but I also think it's the most valuable one, especially for people who are writing their first book. For me, someone who's writing their first book and doesn't hire a developmental editor is making the biggest mistake they can make when it comes to the publication of their book. Because they're not only just gonna make the manuscript better, they're gonna teach you things about writing
Mm,
through working on your manuscript that you would maybe not learn even if you took all the writing classes in the world. They're going to teach you things about point of view, about characterization, about story structure, about dialogue, about all these things, but applied to your book, like with one example that is your book, and they're going to work hand in hand with you. So it's what I hear from every author who works with a developmental editor is that it's a huge learning experience for them, and it doesn't just make that first book better; it makes any future book immediately a lot better. Obviously, if it's the tenth book you write in your space opera series and the plot usually follows the same elements and the world is the same and all that, maybe you don't need a developmental editor at this point. You've got things pretty well figured out. But at this point, you'll definitely want a copy editor and a proofreader if you can still afford them, because you want to make your books really professional and you don't want them to have any typos that could deter from the reading experience. So yeah, editing's expensive, but you also have to think from the editor's perspective. Like, they're reading the book several times, they're annotating. That's hours and hours and hours of work, often by people who've become really, really pros at that, who've been veteran editors for a lot of years. Um, so yeah, it makes sense that it's expensive
yeah.
and it's worth it.
Well, and if you're just getting started and you know, you're new to the game and your copy isn't real clean, and it's harder for an editor to kind of get familiar with your work. But the thing that really hit me with what you said there was when you think about this investment is not just the process of specifically editing this book, but it's almost like you're hiring a coach, right?
Absolutely.
And you think about the money that gets spent on courses and um, all the stuff out there for writing a bestseller. If you kind of think about rather than spending that on a course that you're going to self-teach, to actually learn kind of on the job, that makes that, for lack of a better term, easier to rationalize the investment.
Yeah.
Right. And I know for, some of the authors that I've been working with is that even if they haven't started out with a developmental editor, if they get to a spot where they have hired one to get them through a block or just some issues, after that, they don't tend to get rid of them. Like, they keep that person, even if it's not a full developmental edit, they're using them almost kind of like I said, like a writing coach, where it's like, hey, give me some feedback on this and what's not working. And it just, it helps you to become a better writer, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And
Anybody that's in sports that is really dedicated to getting better at their game hires coaches for different parts of their game, right? So if they're, a professional golfer, they're going to hire a swing coach, or they're going to hire a putting coach, work on the areas where they're weaker.
absolutely. We actually considered adding writing coaches to Reedsy at some point. But when we really looked into it, we realized that they were all developmental editors at the end of the day. Like, there's a very, very fine line there's just some who've been clever at marketing themselves as like writing coaches or book coaches or book shepherds. But at the end of the day, it's just developmental editors who intervene maybe at an earlier stage. I know some developmental editors don't want to look at the first draft, let alone like a first chapter or an outline. Some others are going to be fine with that. And we have several developmental editors on Reedsy who'd like consult on outlines or even